Okay, boys and girls, we're going to read the second story in A Cinderella for Everyone, Teaching Cultural Diversity Through Literature. Today, I'd like to read Rough-Faced Girl. It's one of my favorite versions of Cinderella. This is an Algonquin tale. The Algonquin Indians were found more in the North America area, Canada, New York, right up there, Great Lakes area. And I just want to read to you the author's note first before we actually start reading the story. The Rough-Faced Girl, an Algonquin Indian Cinderella, is, in its original form, actually part of a longer, more complex traditional story. Brief as it is, however, the Rough-Faced Girl remains one of the most magical, mysterious, and beautiful of all Cinderella's tales. Grown on native soil, its mystery is rooted in our own place. I am happy to pass it on to children and parents today. And that was from the author, Rafe Martin. And the illustrator is David Shannon, and many of you know him from the Know David books. So you're going to actually see a really interesting story illustrated by someone you actually have read before. Once long ago, there was a village by the shores of Lake Ontario. And Ontario is a province in Canada. Off from the other wigwams of this village stood one great huge wigwam. Painted on its sides were pictures of the sun, moon, stars, plants, trees, and animals. And inside this wigwam there was said to live a very great, rich, powerful, and supposedly handsome, invisible being. However, no one could see him except his sister, who lived there too. Many women wanted to marry this invisible being, but his sister said only the one who can see him can marry him. And there is the wigwam with all the pictures. Now, in this village, there lived a poor man who had 3 daughters. The 2 older daughters were cruel and hard-hearted, and they made their younger sister sit by the fire and feed the flames. When the burning branches popped, the sparks fell on her. In time, her hands became burnt and scarred. Her arms, too, became rough and scarred. Even her face was marked by the fire, and her beautiful long hair hung ragged and charred. And those 2 older sisters laughed at her, saying, "Ha! You're ugly, you rough-faced girl." And they made her life very lonely and miserable indeed. And here you can see the 2 mean sisters and the rough-faced girl right here. One day, these 2 older sisters went to their father and said, "Father, give us some necklaces, give us some new buckskin dresses, give us some pretty beaded moccasins. We are going to marry the invisible being." So their father gave them these things. Dressed in their finest, the 2 girls marched through the village. All the people pointed and stared. "Look at those beautiful girls," they said. "Surely they shall marry the invisible being." And if those 2 girls were proud and hard-hearted before, they were even prouder now. They walked haughtily through the village. At last they came to the wigwam of the invisible being, and there was his sister waiting. And there are the sisters in their fine new wares. "Why have you come?" she asked. "We want to marry the invisible being," they answered. "That's why we're here." "If you want to marry my brother," she replied, "you have to have seen him. Tell me, have you seen the invisible being?" "Of course we've seen him," they insisted. "Can't you see how pretty we are? Can't you see the beautiful colors we wear? Oh yes, anyone can tell that we've truly seen the invisible being." "All right," she said quietly. "If you think you've seen him, then tell me, what's his bow made of?" And suddenly her voice was swift as lightning and strong as thunder. And there is the sister of the invisible being. His bow?" they stammered in surprise. "His bow, we know. But turning desperately to one another, they whispered, "What shall we say? Let's say it's an oak tree." So they said, "It's a great oak tree." "No," answered the sister of the invisible being. "No." Oh, she saw at once how they lied. "Tell me," she continued, "if you think you've seen my brother, the invisible being, then what's the runner of his sled made of?" We know," cried those two sisters. But whispering feverishly again, they wonder, "What shall we say? What shall we say?" "Let's say it's the green willow branch." "No," said the sister when she heard. "No, you have not seen my brother. Now go home." "Just test us fairly," they exclaim. "We've seen him. Just don't ask us all these silly questions." And here are the two sisters whispering to each other. "All right," said the sister of the invisible being. "Come with me." And she took them into the great wigwam and sat them in the seats furthest from the entrance, the guest seats. Soon they heard footsteps coming along the path. Then something stepped inside. Though they heard breathing, the two sisters couldn't see a thing. Suddenly, a great bow and a beaded quiver of arrows appeared in the air and were set down. But those two girls sat there, their eyes wide. All through the night they saw nothing. And in the morning they had to go home ashamed. And there is the quiver and the bow just hanging in the air in front of them. The next day the rough-faced girl went to her father and said, "Father, may I please have some beads? May I please have a new buckskin dress and some pretty moccasins? I am going to marry the invisible being, for wherever I look, I see his face." But her father sighed. "Daughter," he said, "I am sorry, but I have no beads left for you. Only some broken shells. I have no buckskin dress. And as for moccasins, all I have left are my own worn, cracked, stretched out ones from last year. And they're much too big." But she said, "Whatever you can spare, I can use." And so he gave her these things. And here she is asking her poor father, and there are the shells and the worn out shoes. Then she found some dried reeds, and taking the little broken shells, she strung a necklace. She stripped birch bark from the dead tree and made a cap, a dress and leggings. Then, with a sharp piece of bone, she carved in the bark pictures of the sun, moon, stars, planet, trees, and animals. She went down to the lakeshore and soaked the moccasins in the water until they grew soft. Then she molded them to her feet, but they were still too big, and they flapped like duck feet as she walked. Then all of the people came out of their wigwams. They pointed and stared. "Look at that ugly girl," they laughed. "Look at her strange clothes. Hey, 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 you go home, ugly girl. You'll never marry the invisible being." But the rough-faced girl had faith in herself, and she had courage, and she didn't turn back. She just kept walking right through the village. And here she is with her bark dress and her big shoes. As she walked on, she saw great beauty of the earth and skies spreading before her. And truly she alone, of all in the village, saw in these things the sweet yet awesome face of the invisible being. And here she is, looking out into the beautiful nature. And there is the invisible being. There's mouth, and there's his eye. At last she came to the lakeshore, just as the sun was sinking behind the hills, and the stars, many, came glittering out like the very veil in the darkened sky overhead. And there, standing by the water's edge, as the sister of the invisible being waiting. Now the sisters of the invisible being was a wise woman. When she looked at you, she didn't see just your face or your hair or your clothes. No, when she looked at you, she would look right into your eyes, and she could see all the way down to your heart. and she could tell if you had a good, kind heart or a cold, hard, and cruel one. And when she looked at the rough-faced girl, she saw at once that, though her skin was scarred and her hair burnt and her clothes strange, she had a beautiful, kind heart. And so she welcomed her dearly, saying, "Ah, my sister, you have come." And the invisible girl replied, "I have come to marry the invisible being." And there is the sister of the invisible being by the water. "Ah," said the sister very gently now, "if you want to marry him, you have to have seen him. Tell me, have you seen my brother, the invisible being?" And the rough-faced girl said, "Yes." "All right then," said the sister, "if you have seen him, tell me, what's his bow made of?" And the rough-faced girl said, "His bow? Why, it is the great curve of the rainbow." "Ah!" exclaimed the sister in excitement. "Tell me," she asked, "if you have seen my brother, the invisible being. What's the runner of the sleds made of?" And the rough-faced girl looked up into the sky and said, "The runner of his sled? Why, it is the spirit road, the Milky Way of stars that spreads across the sky." And there he is, standing on those very stars. "Ah!" cried the sister in wonder and delight. "You have seen him. Come with me." And taking the rough-faced girl by the hand, she led her back to the great wigwam and sat her in the seat next to the entrance, the wife's seat. Then they heard footsteps coming along the path, closer and closer. The entrance flap of the wigwam lifted up, and in stepped the invisible being. And when he saw her sitting there, he said, "At last we have been found out." Then, smiling kindly, he added, "Oh my, sister, but she is beautiful." And sister said, "Yes." And there is the invisible being looking down on the rough-faced girl. The sister of the invisible being then gave the rough-faced girl the finest buckskin robes and a necklace of perfect shells. "Now bathe in the lake," she said, "and dress in these." So the rough-faced girl bathed in the waters of the lake. Suddenly, all the scars vanished from her body. Her skin grew smooth again, and her beautiful black hair grew in long and glossy as the raven's wing. Now everyone could see that she was indeed beautiful, but the invisible being and his sister had seen that from the start. There she is, now oh so beautiful with no scars. Then at last the rough-faced girl and the invisible being were married. They lived together in great gladness and were never parted. And there she is, leaving with the invisible being in his canoe. And that's the end of our beautiful story. It's a little different than most Cinderella stories. We don't have an evil stepmother. But take a minute and think about, how is it alike to other Cinderella stories? Was it similar to Cinderillion, which I read previously? And how did the pictures in the story help relate the theme? And maybe you can figure out what the theme is.